Okay, so we've got a cutaway of a carburetor from a 9.9 horsepower Yamaha Outboard. So we're going to go ahead and look at the top here. We can see all our fuel passages up there, and where we have our idle mixture adjustment, our little screw comes through there. We'll go ahead and look at the back side here. We've got our throttle plate and our accelerator pump cutaway that we can see. So as we open the throttle, you can see how the accelerator pump deplunges. We've also got our choke right here. So we can go ahead and use our choke plate as well. And our setup today is that we've got water dyed green siphoned from that water bottle up there, and that's going to come in as our fuel line. We've got our fuel cutoff switch, or our fuel on-off, as this little vice grip here. And we'll go ahead and look as the carburetor fills up with water, and then we've got our intake tube there, and that's going to be our intake on the motor. We'll hook it up to a shop vac and turn that on and see how the fuel flows through the carburetor. You can see in the center there we have a cutaway of a float, and we've got our jets hanging down there inside of clear vinyl tubing. We'll watch how the fuel flows right through them. So we've got our float into position now. The float floated up and turned off the, pushed up on the needle valve on the back side here. That keeps the fuel level right about there. You can see the jets are submerged. So we'll go ahead and we'll turn on our vacuum cleaner here, and we'll watch the fuel flow through the carburetor. It's going to come mostly from our idle adjustment just behind the throttle plate, right here, back by that little white plug at first, and then as we open up the throttle plate, we'll see it coming through the jet that's right through this little window on the side there. Choke's open, throttle plate's closed. We'll turn our vacuum cleaner on. And we can see a tiny bit of fuel mixing, and you can see it appearing on the vinyl tube there as it flows back in. We'll go ahead and open up our throttle plate a little bit. You can see a lot more fuel flowing as we open the throttle plate up, and you can also begin to see the fuel flow from the jet inside the venturi there. We'll go ahead and turn our throttle plate closed. You can see as we open the throttle plate again, more fuel flows from the venturi. We'll see what it does when we go ahead and activate the choke. We can see there's more fuel going into the airline there. So that's a lot more fuel than there was without the choke. We'll go ahead and turn the choke off. And if we go ahead and can turn our fuel off when we run out of fuel. Go ahead and open our throttle plate up, simulate full throttle, and see how long that bowl full of fuel will last us. And that's really it. So the bowl still has a little bit of fuel in there, but it's not quite enough to get sucked up into the jet, so we can see very little fuel is flowing through the intake there. And that's what it would look like when you run out of gas. So to recap everything you just saw, down here is our bowl, and our bowl is where the fuel is contained. So the fuel comes in through our fuel intake, goes through this little needle valve that's connected to the float, and when the fuel level gets high enough in here, the float floats up and shuts off this little needle valve, stopping the flow of fuel coming in. When you start to have airflow through the carburetor, there's a venturi, or basically a narrow part of the carburetor that speeds up the flow of air, which in turn lowers its pressure. That's Bernoulli's principle. And that low pressure pulls fuel up through these jets into the airstream and sends it towards the motor. Same thing happens when the motor is just running at idle, but instead of going through all these jets, we actually just go right through the top here when we have our mixture idle adjustment screw right in here. And that little needle valve controls how much fuel goes through into the intake at idle. It's kind of difficult to see there, but just above the throttle plate there's a tiny little pinhole, and that little pinhole is where the fuel comes through when the motor is running at idle. It uses very, very little fuel for this 9.9 horsepower motor when it's at idle. And just above that pinhole is where your needle screw is at, and that controls how much fuel is going in per the amount of air that's going in as well. So looking at the top of our carburetor, we have these little passages here. These little passages are overflow passages. If the float were to get stuck, say, and let too much fuel in, the fuel would flow up into these and flow over the sides of the carburetor, so that would actually be wasting fuel, and obviously pretty bad for the environment to let water, or to let fuel flow out of the carburetor into the water. And then up top here is where we have the fuel that flows in for our idle mixture adjustment. The front of the carburetor here is where we can see our choke plate. And so the choke plate's open. When we close the choke plate, it restricts the airflow through the carburetor, and that in turn creates a greater low pressure in front of the throttle plate and pulls more fuel in. So imagine with our throttle plate being open and pulling in a lot of air, and then we close our choke plate, and that would create a large low pressure right onto the jets, more so than the venturi would alone, and that pulls in a lot more fuel. So that helps you start up when it's cold or when there's not quite enough fuel pulled through the system just yet. On the side here is where we have our throttle connection to actuate our throttle plate, and you can also see we have this little accelerator pump. That little piston there is what pushes down and pushes fuel into that little barb just above the choke plate there, and that'll send extra fuel. Hopefully you can see the little barb on the left hand side there. So that little barb you can see just on the left hand side there, that's where the extra fuel comes in from our accelerator pump. And the reason we have that is if you rapidly open the throttle and provide the engine lots more air all of a sudden, you also need to provide it more fuel. You have to maintain that fire triangle, the right amount of fuel and air to keep the engine running. And so if you rapidly open this, it takes time to create low pressure and pull extra fuel in, so this pump actually gives a good little push of fuel directly into the airstream and keeps everything running stoichiometrically. And of course it's worth mentioning too the little barb there just below the choke plate that you see halfway through the carburetor. That's actually right in the center of the venturi, and that is your main jet. So that is where all your fuel is going to come from when you're running at anything above idle, basically. Fuel starts to flow through there as we get airflow through the carburetor and gets squeezed through there. You get the low pressure and it pulls fuel up through that main jet there. And so during the video you could see a little bit of green squirting through that main jet. And so that's basically all we have. It's just the whole idea here is you have airflow through, it speeds up in that Venturi there creates a low pressure, pulls fuel up and mixes the fuel with the air. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions, leave us a comment or shoot us a note on the website. Thanks for watching.